being recorded.
Jazakallah khair, brother Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. So this is going to be a little strange because I cannot see anyone, but inshallah we'll try our best. So I'm going to jump into it right away. So where we left off the last time we caught up was in early March, and we started with the tafseer of Surah Al-Fajr. Where we left off was at the end of verse number 5. And I'll just recollect a couple of things before I move on to verse number 6. This surah, as you know, was a Makki surah, which means it is going to talk about the three themes that are always there for any Makki surah are Tawheed, Risala, and Day of Judgment. And this surah is going to talk about at least two of these. If some Mufassirun say it's going to talk about all three. So we talked about the first 5 verses. We said that this surah has 5 sections, right? The first section is what we covered last time, which is talking about the 4 oaths: wal fajr, wal layalin ashr, wal shafi wal watr, wal layli iza yasr. So after these 4 oaths, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has transitioned into something very unique in the Quran, which he doesn't do often. The only other examples that I gave you, there were a couple of places. One of the examples I gave you was La uqsimu bihazal balad, La uqsimu bi yawm al-qiyamah. Those are the places where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala swears, takes another oath. But this time he swears by himself, right? So, wal fajr wal layalin ashr wal shafi wal watr wal layli iza yasr hal fi zalika qasamul lizi hijr. In that verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has talked about, isn't there enough in these 4 oaths for you to reflect and think about? And subhanAllah, we spent an entire hour on these 5 verses because they have such a depth of meaning in there. Just to recap a bit, at a high level, the first 4 oaths are talking about, well, Fajr it can refer to Fajr, but it can also refer to the victory of Islam. And we said the first and the fourth verse were related. So the 4th verse was talking about walayalin ashr. So the second was walayalin ashr, wa shafi wal watr, wal layli iza yasr. So if you look at the 4th, it was wal layli iza yasr, which means this day will pass, and the night when it passes. And the night passes very quickly. So the first one was Fajr, which is the victory of Islam. It can also refer to the day of resurrection. And wal layli iza yasr refers to the night which passes, and we gave multiple interpretations of that. It could be referring to the night of Muzdalifah. It could be referring to the fact that night is coming. It's the last hour of the night. Sorry, Fajr is coming. And the second and third we said are related. Walayalin ashr, which is by the 10 nights. And the majority opinion was the 10 nights are the 10 nights of Dhul Hijjah. And Washafi wal Watr was referring to, again, the day of resurrection where things are going to become even. Things that are uneven in this world are going to become even. So with that backdrop, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that isn't there enough in this for people of Hijr, which means people of intellect. And we talked about why Hijr was compared to a rock. So that was the first section. Now, after doing these, after talking about these sections, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has now moved the attention away, to history. He is now going to go back and talk about, now with these oaths, they were very strong reminders for the people. And who else was listening? The Quraysh. And now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to talk about how he had destroyed the nations in the past when they had rebelled. And so the next 8 verses are going to talk about 3 specific nations: Ad, Samud, and Firaoun, right? And this is going to be the section 2, which is talking about how those nations were destroyed and why those nations were destroyed, right? Just to repeat it, verses 6 to 14, that is the section that we are going to do today. It's going to talk about how those 3 nations were destroyed and why were they destroyed. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. هل في ذلك قسم لذي حجر ألم تر كيف فعل ربك بعاد. Have you not considered how your Lord dealt with Ad? So Ad is a people who lived like 4 centuries after Nuh alayhi salam, right? the scholars have said that the people of Ad were the people who lived 4 centuries after, or 4 generations after Nuh alayhi salam. And this was something that was people as the Quraysh who are listening. The Quraysh it was very familiar to the Quraysh who the people of Ad are, because they were the people who were living in Yemen, or who had lived in Yemen. And as the Quraysh would pass by they would see their remnants. They would see, Ad used to live here. So a few things about Ad. As I said, there were 4 generations after Nuh. And then the other thing would be, Allah has used a very specific term here, which is Alam Tara. Tara has the notion of seeing as in understanding. It is not seeing as in, like in the previous surah, Allah said, Afala yanzuruna, which means, Afala yanzuruna ila libili kayfa khuliqat, which was in Surah Ghashiyah, was, Surah number 88. Now that yanzuruna is about seeing and staring and understanding. But this tara is referring to understanding, as in where you say, I see what you mean, right? It's the same thing as tara. Alam tara kaifa. Allah said, kaifa. Think of how those nations were destroyed. And I'm going to talk about those people of Ad. They were very powerful, strongly built, very sophisticated people who lived in, as I said, what is today Yemen and those areas. So Allah did not talk about, the fact that, he talks about how they were destroyed, which means it is just pointing out to the Quraysh, just think of those people. They were somebody who was so powerful that they rebelled against their messenger. Hud was sent to them, and they would say, who is more powerful than us? That may sound familiar to all of us. And I will connect it to the times that we are living in now in a bit. But just imagine, Allah SWT power is, Allah SWT is not just, He's omnipotent, but in the time when you least expect punishment is going to pour down on you. And that is exactly what happened with the people of Ad. So as I said, this nation lived 4 generations after Nuh. They were a very powerful nation. They built enormous beams. They used pillars in construction. They built tall buildings. And everybody was scared to go to battle with them. And as I said, the Arabs, when they would pass by Makkah and the neighborhood, they would see their remains. So Allah has used the term kaifa, which is how were they destroyed. So 2 lessons in this, right? The first is, Allah is trying to convey that no matter how powerful you are, no matter how advanced or sophisticated or technologically advanced you are, if Allah wills, He can bring you down on your knees, right? And again, as I'm going through these verses, think of what has happened to the world in the last few weeks. Think of what is happening to us in the last few weeks, and keep that backdrop in mind. Allah can control things with, like in the case of coronavirus, He's changing the world with something as small, as tiny as the virus, which you cannot even see with the naked eye. You need a microscope to see that. And going back to Ad, in a surah, in Surah Buruj, which we all know, Surah number 84, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, إن الذين فتنوا المؤمنين والمؤمنات ثم لم يتوبوا فلهم عذاب جهنم ولهم عذاب الحريق. Indeed, those who have tortured the believing men and the believing women and then have not repented will have the punishment of hell, and they will have the punishment of the burning fire. So the first one was, it's basically, this verse is conveying that Allah SWT is always in control. The second is, it is a very strong threat to the disbelievers, saying, think of the Ad. Ad were way more powerful than you. The people of Ad were way more powerful than the Quraysh. Remember, the audience here is the Quraysh. So they were way more powerful than the Quraysh, and yet they were destroyed. So in this surah, Allah SWT has warned by examples, like in the first example is of Ad. The other thing that Allah SWT has said is, Alam tara kaifa fa'ala rabbuka bi'ad. He also mentioned Rabbuka, which means your Lord, right? And so it's very it's in a very clear reference to the Quraysh, where he's saying, look how your Lord, the people of Quraysh, how your Lord dealt with Ad, who are way more powerful than you. And the problem that they have, or the mistake, or the issue they had, was they had rebelled against the messengers. Then Allah continues, verse number 7, Eram Zatil Imad. So there are two things here to worth pointing out. Eram Zatil Imad. What is Eram? And what does Imad mean, right? So the rough translation would be Eram, who had built lofty pillars, or who had lofty pillars, right? Zatil Imad. So Eram, there are three opinions about Eram. The first opinion is Eram was the founder. He was a founder of Ad, and he was the grandfather of Hud. That is one of the opinions that is mentioned by the Mufassirun. The second is it is a generation that lived before Ad, and it was the forefather, or Eram was a generation that were the forefathers of both Ad and Samud. So we're going to talk about Samud in a bit. They are a generation that come after Ad, and in the two verses down the road we'll talk about Samud. And the third opinion is Eram is a forefather of both Ad and Samud, but closer to Ad, right? So the big thing about Eram was Eram Zatil Imad, where they were possessing of big pillars, lofty pillars, which means two things. One is they were themselves physically very strong, tall and strong, so had big bodily strength. The other thing is they also built tall pillars, right? And Ad and Samud, as I said, are in the they used to live in close proximity.
Brother Sabah, you unmuted. You muted yourself.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that. So where was I? When was the last time what was the last verse I was on? Did you hear the Eram description? Okay. So I was in verse number 8. Allati lam yukhlaq misluha fil bilad. The likes of whom had never been created in this land. And I was talking about bilad, which means a city which has forts around it, and it can defend itself. But they couldn't defend against Allah's punishment, right? And as I was saying, saying that think of the situation we are in, where doesn't matter how technologically advanced you are, in front of coronavirus, everyone is on their knees. The next verse number 9, is وَثَمُودَ الَّذِينَ جَابُوا الصَّخْرَ بِالْوَادِ. And with Samud, who carved out rocks in the valley. So Samud, as I said, was a generation right after Ad, right? And Eram was the forefathers of both of them. people of Samud were known for building big, huge buildings from rocks. So if you can look at the, if you Google it, if you go to Petrus Valley in Jordan, you can see some of those structures that I'm talking about. They used to build huge buildings made from rocks. And Allah SWT is just giving the Quraysh an example, one example after the other, where he's saying, look, even with all this, people couldn't defend themselves. So why do you think Allah's punishment is not going to come to you, O Quraysh? And the term Sakhr is very important here. Sakhr refers to a large rock, and it's not just carving, it's not just using rock, it was actually carving into rocks, right? And that is what Samud was known for, carving into rocks. And that requires a lot of not just sophisticated infrastructure, but also it means they had the tools and the methodology to do that. So, and they would do it in the term Wad refers to valley normally, but also in this case refers to, like, they were a very prosperous people, right? They built tall buildings, they carved from stones, and they were really well-to-do and very prosperous. And yet the common theme is Allah SWT is giving these two examples and saying, look, they had no power against Allah's punishment when it came down. Going forward, and then it's going to go to another famous generation or notorious generation, which is the generation of Firaoun, and it's going to talk about Firaoun. Verse number 10, وَفِرْعَوْنَ ذِي الْأَوْتَادِ, and with Firaoun, Zil Autad, which means the pegs or the stakes in the ground. So Firaoun is known as the owner of, in this verse he's called Zil Autad, which is the owner of pegs. And pegs are something you keep in the, mountains are called pegs, for example. You peg them, you put them in the ground. They're like stakes. So there are three reasons why, there are three opinions about why Firaoun is called owner of pegs in this verse. The first one is Firaoun, as you can remember, is known for his, he used to crucify people, right? In fact, Asiya, his own wife, he had crucified. There are historical accounts of, and Asiya is mentioned in Surah Tahrim, right, as one of the best women who ever lived, along with Maryam. And in that same surah, the verse right after it, and the next two talks about the wives of Nuh alayhi salam as well as Lut alayhi salam. So two of the best people and two of the worst people, right? Two of the best women and two of the worst women. So if you want to take a reference, it's going to be verse number 10 to 12 is what I'm going to give you a reference of Surah Tahrim, which is Surah number 66. It talks about Asiya. It talks about the wife of Lut. It also talks about the wife of Nuh. And of course, the next two verses, 11 and 12, will talk about Maryam, and we'll talk about Asiya, the wife of Firaoun. So historical records have said that when he discovered that she was a monotheist and she worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, he had her crucified. So the first example why he's called Zil Autad, or the owner of pegs, is because he would crucify people by pegging them to this crucifix. The second opinion is because he had huge, large standing armies. And by standing armies, you can understand what is meant by that is when armies camp, they put their tents and peg them to the ground. So that is the other reason why it's called Zil Autad. And the third is construction, like pyramids, right? People even now go to Egypt to see the pyramids that were built by the pharaohs. So Firaoun is also known for construction of these buildings, which were like pegs, like pyramids. So Allah SWT is again coming back to the same theme, which is take examples of these three people who were way more powerful, way more advanced than you, which is the Quraysh, and yet they were destroyed, right? وَفِرْعَوْنَ ذِي الْأَوْتَادِ الَّذِينَ طَغَوْا فِي الْبِلَادِ. So now the theme is going to change. So far, Allah SWT has given examples of three generations of three people who were destroyed, and He's actually asking people to wonder, to ponder over it. How could they be destroyed when they were so powerful, right? He gave examples of why they were so powerful. And now, after having people ponder over, look, your power is not going to be sufficient against Allah. He's not going to say why were they destroyed, right? Allazina taghaw fil bilad. So taghaw, allazina taghaw fil bilad. So taghaw is actually referring to when an example that I heard about the word taghaw is I think that actually resonates with me is if you fill a water to the brim, right? If you take a glass of water, fill the water to the brim, what happens next? The water starts spilling over. That is called taghaw, which means they had oppressed and their oppression knew no bounds. They had oppressed against, they were given a lot of power. They were given a lot of, wealth and authority. All three generations, right? All three peoples, Ad, Samud, and Firaoun. So they had power, they had wealth, they had authority, and yet they did taghaw, right? Allazina taghaw fil bilad, in the bilad. Again, the same term is used that was used before, bilad. Remember? Even though they had fortified cities, they had gone beyond what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given them, right? And so the rhetorical question that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking the Quraysh is, now who can prevent you from Allah's punishment if it comes down? Who can prevent you from Allah's punishment? With all these people who were way more powerful than you, they were destroyed. Their money, their wealth, their power was meaningless. Who is it? Who can stop you? Who can stop Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from destroying you? Why do you think you're so safe? Right? And so going back to this, Allazina taghaw fil bilad, they had rebelled. And what was the rebellion? They had rebelled against their messengers who were sent from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They had rebelled against justice. They had become unjust, right? We all know the story of Firaoun, for example, right? And the other places which talks about Ad and Samud, how they had gone against the messengers, right? Against Saleh and against Hud, and Musa and Harun alayhi salam were sent to the people of Firaoun. So basic principles of the Deen. So this is actually a very good segue into the rest of the description that we will do, or rest of the subject that we'll tackle today. So I want to connect it back to the state of the Muslims, right? Without pointing any fingers, you can see that the state of the Muslims across the world, we have strayed away from the basic principles of the Deen. We are very specific about, well, we'll only eat halal food, or we will, when it comes to fiqh, we are very, very particular, right? Should I wipe over my socks? How many rukus? How many rakas should I pray? How many sunnahs are there in every prayer? All that is good. But then what happens is we sometimes forget the very basics of a religion, right? Even in spite of all these, we will lie, we will cheat, we will steal. And I'm specifically calling out the Muslim community here. Not here, I mean in general, across the world. And this is what this verse is talking about, is Allazina taghaw fil bilad. If you commit injustice on the land, guess what? Allah's punishment is coming, right? The moment you have corruption, the moment you have oppression, the moment you have injustice, Allah's punishment is coming down on you. So, Allazina taghaw fil bilad fa'aktharu fiha al-fasad. This just continues the same theme. And they had increased the fasad in that land. Fiha al-fasad. They had increased. Aksar means increase, right? Fiha al-fasad. In the land, they had increased in fasad. What is fasad? Fasad is nothing but corruption, injustice. And again, because we are living at this time, we should all reflect and see what have we done, right? Like the situation that we are in, it could be a blessing or it could be a punishment, Allahu alam, right? But what have we done as a community? I'm not talking about the specific situation we are in. Are we just, or as a whole, are we unjust? And I don't even have to give examples. You can see all across the world. Look at what has happened in Yemen. Look at what has happened in Syria, right? Look at what is happening in Burma, in China, and so on. Oppression after oppression after oppression. Palestine, right? Egypt, a few years ago, it is still going through it. Libya, and so on. Oppression has really come to a point where you don't even think, it doesn't raise your eyebrows anymore. It is becoming so common. And that is what these people had done. فَأَكْثَرُوا فِيهَا الْفَسَادِ. They had caused a great amount of fasad on the earth, used the resources for evil. And again, I'm going to keep bringing back to the Muslim society as a whole. Have we really, this is a question for everyone to ponder, have we really done justice to our role here in this world? And I'm going to leave it at that. فَأَكْثَرُوا فِيهَا الْفَسَادِ فَصَبَّ عَلَيْهِمْ رَبُّكَ سَوْطَ عَذَابٍ. And now there's another transition. So first, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala talked about the peoples and how the three peoples or three generations, how they had been given a lot of power. And then he went about what had they done. They had created fasad. They had made oppression commonplace. And then, so what happened next? فَصَبَّ عَلَيْهِمْ. Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala poured. Fasabba is poured. It's not just brought down punishment, it's like poured in a huge amount. Alayhim, on them. Rabbuka, again, your Lord. It's referring to imagine the listener is going to be amazed. Anytime they hear it, it's actually referring to them directly. So a small tangent here. Anytime you read the Quran and you read the translation, think of the Quran as talking to you directly. Not to anyone else, not to the community, not to a bunch of people, to you. Rabbuka, right? Your Lord. The Quran is addressing you. And who else is the Quran addressing? Because the Prophet ﷺ was reciting it, it's referring to the Quraysh. And you can see their amazement and their shock when they say, فَصَبَّ عَلَيْهِمْ رَبُّكَ, your Lord brought down on them Sauta azab. Saut means a whip, right? Saut means a whip. And if you look at how the whip operates, right? When you whip somebody, right? The thing it hits the most is on the skin. And subhanAllah, once the skin is taken away, right? You can still go through a lot of, you don't feel pain. Your body can still go through a lot of transitions, but it's the skin that acts as a protective covering. Like people who have taken biology, or they will understand the thin layer that we have on the skin. How many nerve endings does it have, right? Millions and millions and billions of nerve endings, right? And those nerve endings are they are the ones that cause you the sensation of pain. Once though you remove the skin, the sensation of pain is gone. Even though the body suffers, sensation of pain is gone. And subhanAllah, if you refer to other places in the Quran, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say he's going to punish the disbelievers in the day of judgment? He's going to burn them in hellfire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from it. He's going to burn them in the hellfire, and when skins are burned, he's going to give them a new skin. That second skin is burnt, he's going to give them a third skin, and so on and so on and so on, infinite times. So you can imagine that is one of the azabs of Jahannam, right? And so even in that there is a miracle, right? I mean, one of the things that drew me to Islam a few years ago was the scientific miracles, and this is one of those scientific miracles that it just amazes you how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so precise and concise in talking about even the skin, just the amount of, and the other places which talks about your fingerprints, right? How they are unique and so on. So I can go in, that's a separate tangent. I can have a separate lecture on scientific miracles. But coming back to this, South, I was referring to South. It is a whip. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to pour on them, Sauta Azab. Or he poured on them Sauta Azab, which means he gave it again and again and again and again. So but before this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said they brought it on themselves. They brought it on themselves, this huge punishment, because of what they had done or what they hadn't done. So what they had done is they had created a lot of oppression and fasad in the land. What they hadn't done is following the book, following the messengers. And subhanAllah, look at the state of the Muslims today, right? Again, I'm going to ask a few questions. I'm not going to make my own judgments. I want all of us to think through it. What have we done to our book? What have we done to the Quran? Are we really following the Quran? Are we following the example of the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? And you can see the state of the Muslim Ummah is actually directly correlated with how much of the Quran are we following. So, coming back to this, فَصَبَّ عَلَيْهِمْ رَبُّكَ سَوْطَ عَذَابٍ. Your Lord poured on them whip of punishment or a scourge of punishment, right? Inna rabbaka labil mirsad. Indeed, and this ayah can be very scary, and it can also, for the believers, it actually gives you a lot of hope. Why? This verse means, indeed, your Lord, again, Rabbaka, your Lord, Inna Rabbaka labil mirsad. You can see Rabbuka is used so many times so far. It is calling out to the Quraysh like, look, your Lord had done that in the past. So don't think you can get away scot-free if you make the same mistakes. Mirsad is referring to, like, if you do like basically referring to being in ambush, right? If you remember what happens in guerrilla warfare, right? Guerrilla warfare, what happens is you're hiding behind something and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. And that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, is he's waiting. He gives you a lot of leeway, he gives you a lot of room. But at some point when he unleashes his whip, you don't know where it's coming from or when it's coming, and B, there is no way you can react to that but by falling down on your knees, right? So mirsad refers to somebody being very watchful, and the term here is mirsad, right? Watchful, and as I said, the example of guerrilla warfare, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying he's waiting to strike. He's ready. And again, I said there are two things here, right? For the disbeliever, it should be a verse of, or a disbeliever or a fasik, it should be a very strong warning, which means Allah's punishment can come down at any point. For the believer, it also gives you hope. As I said, examples of Syria, even India, Yemen, Palestine, Burma, you name it, the list goes on and on. How much oppression has happened in the last, let's say, 10 years? Forget about the last century. Let's say the last 10 years. And it's just increasing. It's just getting worse every day. The whip of Allah can come at any point. And when we least expect it, the victory of Allah is coming, right? Because Inna Rabbaka labil mirsad. So far, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said is, remember those 4 oaths with the Jawabul Qasam? The second section was talking about what happened in the past. And now, right in the middle of the surah, verse number 15 and 16, that's what we are going to talk about, and we are going to end there, is the central message of this surah. And I'll need some time to explain this, but this is, I think, the climax of this surah, right in smack in the middle. Now, Surah Fajr has 30 verses. The middle 2 verses, the exact center of the verse, if you look at divide 30 by 2, that is 15. The exact center of the verse is section 3, which is 15 and 16. And that is referring to how the right attitude for the Muslims, right? So I'm going to read it, explain it, and then I'm going to connect it back to why I think this is the climax of the surah, and also why it is the centralmost message. If this is the only thing you can get out of this session, I would say listen to the next 10 minutes or so. فَأَمَّا الْإِنسَانُ إِذَا مَا ابْتَلَاهُ رَبُّهُ فَأَكْرَمَهُ وَنَعَمَهُ فَيَقُولُ رَبِّي أَكْرَمَنِ. فَأَمَّا الْإِنسَانُ إِذَا مَا ابْتَلَاهُ رَبُّهُ. So the operative term is مَبْتَلَاهُ, right? So the first verse is referring, I'll just translate and then I'll move into word by word. And as for man, when his Lord tries him, mabtalahu, when his Lord, Rabbuhu, again, the term will be, it's a direct, the verse is very direct. Rabbuhu, your Lord, when his Lord tries him, with what? Right? Mabtalahu means tries him. فَأَكْرَمَهُ وَنَعْمَهُ. So he tries him by 2 things. One is by akramahu, which is he gives him honor, he gives him nobility. And the second is wana'amahu, he gives him wealth, right? Ni'mah. Wana'amahu fayaqulu. Fayaqulu means he talks about it again and again and again. Fayaqulu Rabbi akraman. He says, my Lord has honored me. The verse, so this is the first part of the middle or the central message of this surah, right? Mabtalahu, as I said, refers to a thorough test, a very strong kind of test, right? But it's talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala testing somebody with wealth and with nobility. How is that possible? Right? That's the first question that you may get. Akramahu, which refers to being noble, being honored, and having wealth, not wealth, having a fame, right? Which means the person is well known, the person is prestigious, he's noble, and he's honorable in society. Fakramahu wa na'amahu. And Nama, as I said, refers to giving him wealth and comfort and money and so on. So this person has both outside wealth, which is well respected, and inside wealth, because in the house he has enough amenity. So his life is good in general, right? You can say life is good for this man. And Allah has used the term for mabtalahu. So how is this a test? This is actually a bigger test than when you're going through difficulty. When you're going through difficulty, when you've lost somebody, when you lost a loved one, when you've lost your job, when you've lost something that you care about and you love, it's easy. It's an easier test because it's a lot easier to be patient at that point. But the problem with when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you wealth and He gives you ni'mah and He gives you akrama, like He gives you nobility and honor and so on, that actually is a difficult thing because you don't realize it's a test. You think Allah is happy with you. He's showering His blessings on you because He's happy, right? And that is something I would just want us to reflect for a bit on some of the worst. Just use this verse and think of some of the worst examples of human beings who were given a lot of nobility and who were given a lot of wealth. Firaoun comes to mind. Some of the leaders that we have around the world comes to your mind. So they were tested with this, right? And some of the hardest tests that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ever given has been with the prophets, right? So the message here is, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you, mabtalahu rabbuhu fa akramahu wa na'amahu fa yaqulu rabbi akraman. They say, Rabbi akraman. My Lord has honored me. Again, the term ikram is used, right? The person never talked about the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given, right? Going back to Surah Kahf, right? If you look in Surah Kahf, the second story that is mentioned after the story of the youth is the story of two men, or the men of the gardens. And one of those men had a lot of gardens, but he did not give any credit to Allah, right? He didn't say it is from Allah. And guess what happened? It got destroyed, right? That's how the story ends. Verse number, I think, 30 to 45, 30 to 44 or something like that. So the problem with so basically the message here is, even when life is good, quote unquote, when you have everything you need, that is a test. And think of it as a bigger test. It can always be taken away from you. It is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Take it as a gift. And when it gets taken away from you, don't cry over it. You never had it in the first place. It was a gift. And that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to tell in this surah, is when man goes through a easy time, he forgets that this is still a test. He's still in a test. And he forgets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He forgets, like, imagine how important is the masjid in these days. When we cannot even go to the masjid, that is how we feel our loss, right? But guess what? When the masjid was open before this whole madness started around the pandemic, how many rows did we have for prayer? And now people are suddenly feeling the need to go back. So basically my point here is, when life is good, take advantage of that time. Because they are, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, good health and time, these are two resources. If you have it, take use of it and come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you never know when these things will not be there with you. And as I said, the problem with when you are in difficult tests, the problem with that is, the reason why it is difficult to understand that it's a test is, you're so much in the moment, you feel that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is happy with me. It may or may not be the case. So think it through. And so it gives you a very profound reality. And the other thing I wanted to hit on is, even in the religious traditions, not just in Muslims, but even in other religions, let's say Hinduism and Judaism and Christianity, you will see this notion of the chosen people, right? we are the chosen people, or we are the people who Allah has honored, right? And everyone else is not. Or even in the Islam, you have some people who say, well, we are the chosen people, right? So I'm not going to give you names, but I just want you to imagine how wrong that kind of thinking is, right? Nobody is honored, nobody is special. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives you is a gift. Take it as a gift, but also take it as a test, right? You don't have control over how long you can keep it. And then it continues. The next verse is going to talk about the flip side of it. Very similar. Verse number 16. وَأَمَّا إِذَا مَا ابْتَلَاهُ فَقَدَرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقَهُ فَيَقُولُ رَبِّي أَهَانَنِ. And now the same man, when Allah tries him, right? Same word, مَبْتَلَاهُ is used. فَقَدَرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقَهُ. فَقَدَرَ means having, restraining or kind of decreasing his risk. فَقَدَرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقَهُ. When his provision is restricted, he says, فَيَقُولُ, and again, فَيَقُولُ, which means he says again and again, Allah has humiliated me, ahanan. My Lord, Rabbi ahanan. My Lord has humiliated me. So faqadara has this notion of having very precise calculation, right? So in this case, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes away the provision. And again, when something is taken away from you, when your risk is, when you lose a loved one, when you lose your job, when you lose your wealth, risk could be in many kinds, right? When you lose your good health, right? That is also a kind of risk. Good health is also a risk. If you lose that, remember, it's always inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. It always is from Allah. It comes from Allah, it goes back to Allah, right? So that's the first attitude that you should do. But in this case, what man generally does is he thinks Allah is humiliating me, and Allah is mad at me, or Allah is angry at me. That may or may not be the true. May or may not be true. So again, connecting these two, both are tests for you. In one test, you may not realize it's a test. You think life is good. It's a test. It's a bigger test. In the other one, you have to have sabr, right? And as the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, Prophet ﷺ said, for a believer, everything that happens to him is good. When he's going to a good time, he says, Alhamdulillah. It is all from Allah, which means it can end at any point, right? And when he's going through a bad time, he has sabr. He doesn't complain, he has sabr, right? And that is the central message of the surah, and that's the central message of Islam. And subhanAllah, I'm not going to talk about this. There's more miracles I'm going to talk about next time when I come back with verse number 17 to 30, and how there's a fascinating end to the surah as well. But the thing that always amazes me is right in the middle of the surah, you have this verse which kind of tells you to take a balanced stance on life, right in the middle of the surah, right? And when you and imagine and really accept qadar, the good and the bad. Sometimes you will have things that are going in your favor. Think of it as a test. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is testing you to see how you will react. And sometimes things are going bad for you. That also is a test. And have sabr. If you lose something, let's say you lose your risk. And again, as I said, risk could be of different kinds. Just remember that morsel of food or that piece of risk was not meant for you. It was not meant to go in your mouth, right? That's why you didn't have it. And the mentality, it also is referring to the term insan is used in this surah, right? The term insan is also interesting because it comes from the root of that meaning means somebody who forgets, right? And man generally forgets that both of these are tests, whether you have blessings or whether your blessings are constricted, right? When the blessings are restricted, both are tests, and it's our goal to have a balanced and keep our eyes on the ball, which is stay on the straight path and work towards your goal. Because guess what? After this test has ended, you'll get another test. Let's say you're going through a good time. This is going to end at some point, and you will go through another test, and so on. Umar ibn al-Khattab said that, he said Umar ibn al-Khattab, and even there are two hadiths, both talk about a similar theme. One is from Abu Ubaidah and one is from Umar ibn al-Khattab. When he was walking to Jerusalem, when we had captured Jerusalem, right? And he had ragged clothes on his way to Jerusalem. Abu Ubaidah said, why are you wearing these ragged clothes? You're coming as a king. You're coming as Amir al-Mu'mineen. He told to Umar al-Khattab, why did you wear these? Why not wear some fancy clothes? Let me put it in the current lingo. So Umar al-Khattab said, had it been anyone other than you, which is Abu Ubaidah, I would have struck you. We are a people that Allah granted honor and respect through Islam. And when we seek it through other than Islam, that is when Allah humiliates us and disgraces us. So I'm going to leave you with this, and we're going to resume with verse number 17. Right in the middle of the surah is the verse that talks about taking a central, taking a balanced attitude towards life, whether it's good or whether it's bad. And it reminds me of Surah Baqarah, right in the middle of the surah, surah number 2, of course, verse number 143, right in the middle, when you have 286 verses in Surah Baqarah, it talks about ummatan wasata, which is you are a balanced nation. وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِيَكُونَ شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ وَيَكُونُ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. And thus we have made you a just community, like a middle nation, that will be a witnesses over other people, and the messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will be a witness over you. And so this is the central theme of the surah, is keep a balanced attitude and never assume that when things are good, those good days are going to continue. Same thing for the bad days. Each of them is a test. The ultimate destination, keep your eyes on the ball. The ultimate destination is, the ultimate success is when you die, you open your eyes and you're in Jannah. That's the best, and that's the only success we have. Everything else is a test. And I'm going to leave with a statement of Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, very famous statement, which I think is very close to my heart. What he said is, a misfortune that brings you closer to Allah, is better than a fortune that brings you farther away from Allah. So just remember that. This is the central message of the sections that we have covered today. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-huzni wal-ajzi wal-kasali wal-bukhli wal-jubni wa dala'i ad-daini wa ghalabatir rijal. O Allah, I take refuge in you from anxiety and sorrow, weakness and laziness, miserliness and cowardice, the burden of debt, and from being overpowered by men. ربنا فاغفر لنا ذنوبنا وكفر عنا سيئاتنا وتوفنا مع الأبرار. O Allah, forgive us our sins, blot out our iniquities, and take to yourself our souls in the company of the righteous. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. If there are any questions, I can take them.
Folks have questions, please unmute yourself and ask your questions. You can also use the chat to ask any questions that you have.
All right. So inshallah, next time we'll continue with verse number 17. Sorry, verse number 17 to 30. Alhamdulillah wa rabbil alameen wa sallallahu wa sallama wa barika ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.
Jazakallah, Brother Sabah, inshallah. We will post this recording on our YouTube channel shortly as well. Thank you everybody for joining, and inshallah we'll see you next week.